Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm Suzanne Bond, president of the Mind and Life Institute, and I'm so glad you're here with us. On July 6th, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, our beloved co-founder, turned 90. This milestone kicked off a year-long global celebration of a life devoted to compassion, wisdom, and the wellness of all living beings. But today, we're not just celebrating his birthday. We're celebrating a revolutionary legacy. His Holiness didn't just engage with science, he transformed it. He challenged scientists to look inward, to ask deeper questions about the mind, emotion, and what it really means to be human. Now, he did this with one bold question. What happens when you bring modern science and ancient contemplative wisdom into real dialogue? That question launched a movement and seeded the many fields that now comprise contemplative science and research. Now, thousands of scientists, practitioners, and changemakers are working at the intersection of inner knowing and empirical inquiry. Their work is transforming mental health, education, and our understanding of human flourishing. Now, today, I get to share a special conversation. I recently sat down with our board chair, Dr. Thupten Jinpa, to reflect on His Holiness's incredible contributions to science, to humanity, and to all of us. Jinpa is uniquely positioned to tell this story. He's a celebrated Tibetan scholar and author, and for over 40 years, he has served as the Dalai Lama's principal English translator and close collaborator. He brings insight, warmth, and some amazing behind-the-scenes stories you won't want to miss. So thank you for joining us. Settle in and enjoy this celebration of one of the most extraordinary lives of our time. Jinpa, thanks so much for inviting us into your home today. It's really exciting to be able to talk with you a little bit about His Holiness, especially as part of this year-long celebration associated with his 90th birthday. Now, before I joined Mind and Life, I thought of the Dalai Lama as being this wise, compassionate, joyful leader, but I had no idea that he had an interest in science. I would love to know a little bit about how that interest began and anything that you could tell us about that.
Thank you. I'm very happy that we're having this conversation as part of an offering for the celebration of 90th year of His Holiness. I was just recently in Dharamsala for the actual birthday celebrations in person, and it was wonderful to be part of that. There were so many people from across the world, and he looked really energized. So His Holiness's interest in science actually began quite early when he was young. As a young monk, who was educated, at the Potala Palace. He was recognized at the age of 2, and, he was asked to assume the leadership of the Tibetan people, political as well as religious, at the age of 16 according to Tibetan years old. As he was growing up in the Potala Palace, he found among the possessions of his predecessor, the 13th Dalai Lama, there were mechanical objects like telescope, and then there was a generator and a projector, and surprisingly also a world atlas with a rotating marker which shows you the different time zones. So I think he was fascinated by these mechanical objects, and there were watches, for example, like the sort of pocket watches. So as a young boy, he talks about this in his biography, where he tells the story of his interest in science. He was fascinated by these mechanical objects because Tibet, until recently, was very traditional society. It's high altitude, no motorable roads beyond the city. So imagine, a young boy, a very curious boy, fascinated by these mechanical objects and wanting to know what is the philosophy and the thought behind the worldview behind these mechanical objects. These mechanical objects were produced by a system of thought, which of course is science. So his interest began quite early, and he in fact tells the story of how he had this telescope, and one evening, and he used to watch the stars quite often, and one evening it was a very clear evening, and he could see shadows on the moon, and he called his tutors to say that that means the light that we see from the moon is actually a reflection coming from somewhere else. So it's not its own light, and which is counter to many of the traditional kind of, narratives of sun and moon. So his interest in science began very, very early out of curiosity. Yeah.
But it was also that he clearly had such a bright mind. I mean, I would look at the same thing and not think anything of it.
Well, that's because of his philosophical training. The classical monastic education that he has received is highly philosophical, and its primary medium through which scholarship is undertaken is debate. It's a constant debate. So you make differences between premises and assumptions and counterexamples and, logical entailment and all of this, and causal relationship, correlations. Many of the ideas that are fundamental to science are also fundamental to Buddhist philosophy, because this is one area where there's a huge convergence between Buddhist approach and scientific approach, because in both cases, the fundamental principle that you appeal to is the law of causality, whether in science or in Buddhism. And Buddhism being a non-theistic religion, it does not seek recourse to a transcendental being as the final cause of reality. It's basically just like science. Everything has to be understood within the framework and context of causes and conditions. So on that front, science and Buddhism are very similar. And similarly, another area where there is a big convergence is that just as in science, empirical evidence is seen as primary source of authority, which is then followed by inference, where based on what you see, you then infer what you can't see. Similarly, in Buddhism, even though it is a religion, the spiritual authority has the least status. It's total opposite to the major world religious traditions where revelation in scripture comes first. In Buddhism, it's the total opposite. So you have the evidence of the senses and empirical evidence as the primary authority. Then, like science, you can have inferences based on what you observe. And then in very rare exceptional situations where you don't have any explanations, then you can cite the authority of the scriptures. So this is one of the reasons why when His Holiness finally had the chance to sit down with scientists, like coming into exile in India as a young man of 24, he was then able to really kind of get deeper into the conversations with science. And then, it's no wonder that he found such affinity with science, because the basic philosophical ideas and principles that underlies both Buddhism and science in relation to understanding the world that we live in, as well as our own existence, is strikingly similar.
Yeah. So then how did all of that interest, as well as his natural curiosity, how did that come to be known as Mind and Life Dialogues?
Well, before Mind and Life began, which is in 1987, the first dialogue was 1987, I had begun serving him as his translator in 1985. And by then, I knew that his conversations with science and dialogues were well established, but on a one-to-one basis. For example, he had long-standing friendship with David Bohm, who is quite a well-known physicist, quantum physicist, and then another quantum physicist by the name of von Weizsäcker, who was a German physicist. And then he had friendships with Karl Popper, who was a philosopher of science. So all of these, I had been at some of these conversations, but those are one-off or one-to-one private conversations. And he had participated in some conferences. For example, I remember being at a conference in Niels Bohr Institute in Denmark because of his interest in quantum physics. But in 87, the first Mind and Life dialogue began. And this was organized by Francisco Varela, who is a young Chilean scientist, teaching in France, quite a well-known neuroscientist, very innovative thinker, a brilliant visionary neuroscientist, also strong leaning towards Buddhist, philosophy and meditation practice. So Varela and Adam Angle, who's an American businessman, they had also been in conversation with Roshi John Halifax. So they had approached His Holiness during one of his visits to Europe and proposed the idea that they could set up a more formal dialogue and bring scientists to his residence to Dharamsala. Because all the dialogues were happening when he was traveling. internationally. So then began the first conference in 1987, and he was completely energized, deeply engaged, and he immediately realized through this 5-day dialogue there are actually important potentials for the two perspectives to be brought together that can really learn from each other, whether it is about the nature of reality, or especially from the Buddhist perspective, the role of mind, because science has much less to say about consciousness and mind and so on, because modern science is predominantly, it's a material paradigm. It's based on analysis of matter. So there was an understanding immediately at the end of the first meeting that there could be a lot more potential for real engagement and kind of, cross-cultural and cross-disciplinary kind of engagement that could have implications down the line. So that 87 meeting was beautiful. It was very intimate in his residence at this small room where he meets people. It's a reception room. So it was fantastic, yeah.
So I think that we have a clip of that very first dialogue. Yes. So maybe we can have a look at that.
Yes.
Your Holiness, we were aware that most of the exposure that you had received from science was mostly from the physical sciences. Now, I happen to be convinced that, in fact, the natural point of bridge between Buddhist tradition and the sciences is not through the physical sciences, but rather through the sciences that are concerned with mind and life itself. Hence, roughly with what we call today the cognitive sciences. That's why we entitled the program Mind and Life rather than Science and Buddhism, for example, because we wanted to focus on that.
As a human being who always used to speak importance of compassion, kindness, in order to have, better human society, happier human society. I believe the deep human feeling is the key factor and the method or means to mental training. So in order to do these things, it is very important to know more about the very nature of mind or consciousness. It is the most important, Western science development and Eastern mental development come together. So I hope this will be a first start if we raise new interest. And there is other people from different places, different fields may involve, may take on interest in more further research work. So its sole aim is for benefit of humanity, for future.
It's so beautiful to see, and it's so beautiful to bring His Holiness into the room like that.
So one thing that reminded me of this clip is that Francisco Varela was aware of His Holiness's long interest in science and his long engagement with science. But he's making the point that up to that point, His Holiness's primary engagement and interest has been with the physics, quantum physics in particular. And Varela is making the point that the more important point of convergence and mutually beneficial dialogue could take place in the kind of the cognitive science area, and which turns out to be true. So today, the whole contemplative science field, research in mindfulness, compassion training, the role of mind, emotional awareness, emotional regulation, all of this is part of that broader, came out of this part of this broader discussion between Buddhist ideas and insights and practices coming together with the research from neuroscience and cognitive science. So that, I think, is an important point that Varela was making. One thing that also I want to remind the viewer is that right from the beginning, on the part of His Holiness, you notice he pointed out two things. One is the primary motive that should underpin all of these dialogues is compassion, a concern for humanity. How can we contribute to the betterment of humanity through ideas, through the way of thinking, through a new way of being in the world? So the primary role of Mind and Life dialogues particularly has been, one of the primary roles has been kind of bringing a human face to science. Because His Holiness, from a very early stage, came to recognize science is a hugely influential, aspect of society, a source of knowledge, source of authority, and for also a compelling source of knowledge for so many people. And also he understands that when it comes to religious beliefs and ideas, there's always going to be diversity and culturally rooted and some often geographically separated. But when it comes to humanity and reality, we need to transcend all of that differences to be able to talk in a universal language, which he believes science can help provide. So this is the reason why he always transcends specificity of the Buddhist ideas, and he used, in fact, the term secular approach. It is a kind of more universal secular approach that takes into account the universality of the human condition and human needs, but the ultimate motivation has to be that of compassion. So that's one very important point he's making. So all of the Mind and Life dialogues, some of them may, in fact, if you look at the specific topic, may be so kind of in a specific, like quantum physics or natural reality, but the underpinning motivation really has to be that of compassion. So that's the important point he's making. The second point he's making is that science is predominantly, rooted in the paradigm of matter, physics, material world. Even if we talk about cognitive science, we're talking about the brain. So neurobiology. And neurobiology is measurable physical entity, physiology. So he's saying that what the Buddhist side can bring is the role of mind. Because even though we can talk about brain and with all the expertise, but in the end, the experience is felt by the individual, and we don't feel brain, we don't experience brain. We experience, emotions, thoughts, ideas. Those are couched in the language of mind. And this is one area Buddhism is tremendously rich. So this is the domain of psychology. So His Holiness is saying that the combination of science and Buddhism can be couched broadly as the sharing of wisdom and knowledge about the material world and the mental world. And then in the end, human beings is both body and mind. Yeah. So in order to fully understand human condition and human reality and the world that we live in, we need full picture, not just from the material body side, but also from the mind, emotion, and feeling side. And he's saying that also, even an important entity and activity like science, even though science itself is neutral, but the neutral activity of science, because of its potential of power, it should be motivated by concern for human feeling and human well-being. So those are important points that you can see His Holiness bringing up right from the beginning in 1987 at the first Mind and Life dialogue.
His Holiness really set the tone for the dialogues, which often lasted up to a week. I have a clip of the great teacher John Kabat-Zinn remarking on just what an experience this was.
Good morning, Your Holiness. We have been going for quite some time now, morning and afternoon, and I must say I am very impressed. I can think of very few heads of state and religious leaders who would consider taking 5 days out of their busy schedule to look at anything. And to do so with the degree of attention and patience and kindness that you have shown to us is quite extraordinary, and I feel very deeply moved to be here.
Well, His Holiness, I think at the beginning, a large part of his enthusiasm was coming from the fact that the Mind and Life organizers have gone to great length to bring people from different parts of the world, especially from North America, quite a far away, to his residence to be able to, for him to have the opportunity to engage deeply in conversation. So I think there was that part, but also, he is genuinely interested in science. He is genuinely interested in the role science can play, the potential science has. He's also genuinely interested in bridging science and Buddhist ideas so that there could be a more comprehensive understanding of reality. And he has also gone on record saying that if there are aspects of traditional Buddhist thought that can be disproven through scientific research, then the time has come for the Buddhist tradition to modify them. And so he's that open. I mean, he's genuinely interested, but he also feels that Buddhist side can offer a lot, especially in the domain of mind. So his interest is quite deep, personal, of course, with the belief that all of this dialogue, what comes out of it, because there is this emergent, in traditional Buddhist thought, particularly in the Tibetan tradition, knowledge production concept is very different from the West. In the West, it's very solitary, like, Isaac Newton sitting under the apple tree and thinking deeply, and then an apple falls, and then ping, the gravitation theory, he discovers it. In the Eastern tradition in general, particularly in the Indian and Buddhist and Tibetan tradition, the knowledge production has a much more dialogical. There's a kind of an emergent idea, because nobody can have a new idea out of the blue without some context. And often, new insights emerge in the context of a discussion and dialogue. So for him, the ability to have the opportunity to spend hours engaging deeply with like-minded, brilliant minds is also enjoyable for him as well, deeply enriching. So yeah, I think that's probably one of the reasons why he spends a lot of time. And I know, for example, later on, after His Holiness won the Nobel Prize in 1989, he became way more on demand, asking, invited, and then politicians and major leaders of the world, as well as celebrities, as well as ordinary people, many people come to see him. The spectrum of people who come to see him, including devout Tibetan Buddhists. So there's a lot of demand on his time. And, the office is trying to struggle for finding a 5-minute here or 10 minutes there. And His Holiness is willing to spend 5 full days. So I think there was a time when the secretaries were beginning to question. And His Holiness said, no. I said, this is important for me, and this is my time. So his commitment was very, very deep. And of course, when you see someone like him committing this much attention and time, then everybody else takes it seriously.
One of the things that surprises me now, there have been 38 dialogues and such a wide range of topics, from neuroplasticity to economics and quantum physics, as you had mentioned, including conversations with Nobel laureates like Anton Zeilinger and Stephen Chu. What was it like to engage with all of these different scientists with such deep expertise in these very diverse areas? What was that like for you?
I mean, for me personally, it was very enriching, very stimulating. Imagine I was much younger, and so being exposed to many of these ideas for the first time. My own training is in philosophy. I've done very little science. And so I think every time there's a new Mind and Life dialogue, the diverse presentations from different scientists who are all great experts in their own field. And also one quality that you will notice in Mind and Life presenters is also the ability to present their ideas and research in clear terms without compromising the rigor. So I think some of the presentations, of course, are like the physics. We had a whole Mind and Life on cosmology and new physics. Anton Zeilinger was one of the speakers. Arthur Zines was there. And then, of course, they did the double slit experiment, this wave-particle duality, randomness that you see in quantum level. All of these very, very esoteric from a layperson's perspective. They're kind of esoteric. So they go quite deep, and His Holiness also follows them. Because His Holiness is not interested in only finding out what the scientists have found. So it's not, when you are presenting to His Holiness, he is not contented with simply someone saying, we know X, Y, and Z. Then his first question would be, how do you know? What questions did you ask? Did you ask that question? Did you rule that out? So because he is looking at the epistemology behind it and the methodology with which led to and what are the, kind of the hypothesis that, led to that finding? Did the hypothesis and the finding match? So he's very interested in all of this. That's because of his debate training. In debate training, you always ask question, why? and you're looking for logical entailment and causal relation, correlation, and all of that. So, His Holiness is, having been trained as a monk in this classical education, the ability to be fully present on a sustained period of time is something that is remarkable that you see in him. But His Holiness is, because of his curiosity and diversity of his interest, he is able to bring that quality of attention to every single presentation. And so the Mind and Life dialogues have been particularly for him personally, and he's very grateful to Mind and Life for offering that platform. It's really for him personally, this has been a huge gift in the form of, like offering a kind of a course for him in his own residence, in his living room, with the best and brilliant minds from specific domains, with well-prepared, curated structure, where he can bring out his best in the context of a conversation.
One of the questions I wanted to ask about was about one of the most well-known dialogues. I think the topic was destructive emotions, and Daniel Goleman's best-selling book, I think, was a product of that. Yeah. And I think we have a clip of that, of Danny maybe posing a question to His Holiness about the role of mindfulness in managing challenging emotions.
One reason we want to have the dialogue with you is that even within the secular context, there are things to learn from Buddhist insights and Buddhist practice that could be applied free of Buddhism.
Yeah, just does it.
And one of those that we were discussing at lunch that has to do with when someone's caught up in an emotion, very angry, what can be done to shorten that period or to help people free themselves from it, and how mindfulness might be applied.
그래요. 그래서 그는 되게 쉽네 지리. 그래서 저희가 되게 늦어야 답답해지게 돼.
When it comes to dealing with destructive emotions and ameliorating them, generally, His Holiness's view is that it's very hard for ordinary people when strong emotion has already occurred. Right there, at that instant, the application of an antidote is very difficult. So therefore, what is required is a general preparation.
Familiarize all these sort of basic sort of because of the practice, wisdom side, and also the method side. All these familiarize, some strength, some experience there. Then anger, attachment, jealousy, all these you see about to come. Then much easier to
deal with them. So if you have that kind of basic kind of preparation, then you may in fact be able to detect the signs of emotions occurring. So in a sense, you would have cultivated a kind of a temperament that would allow you to detect early signs of the occurrence of these emotions so that you can prevent their arisal. Or if that is not possible, when anger arises or these emotions arises, you may not let yourself be kind of overtaken by them. Even if that is not possible, at least you will be able to ensure that these powerful destructive emotions do not get translated into negative actions that are destructive to others and oneself.
So the final point, we may not be completely free, but there are methods that we can investigate and explore to reduce. And that's why we're here.
That's our aim. In any way, really worthwhile, make attempt.
I have to say, I love seeing the young Jinpa.
No, everybody is quite much younger there, including Danny, and Paul Ekman was there. So this was a hugely important Mind and Life. The focus was really on emotion, and the aim was to bring together wisdom from the Buddhist traditions and growing understanding of emotion in science. And Paul Ekman is a pioneer when it comes to the science of emotion, because in fact many people don't know actually emotion is fairly new subject in science. In science, for a long time, people forget that the most influential model of understanding human experience was called behaviorism. So behaviorism basically had this very strange idea that there's a stimulus coming from the outside, and then you have your mind. So mind is like a black box, and what comes out is that behavior in action, whether you say something or you act it out. So what is in between, there was no question being asked. So the predominantly human motivation and human thoughts were understood primarily from the behavior perspective. So that was hugely influential, partly because science did not have the methodology to actually study mind and consciousness, because science needs to measure something. Because if science can't measure and quantify and repeat the experiment, then you can't get a handle on it. I mean, that's the nature of the scientific, inquiry and activity. So only with the development of new imaging technologies like MRI and EEGs that scientists were able to start looking at brain in action, as it were. So, of course, most scientists would say mental experience and emotions are kind of expressions of the functions of the brain. And brain, certain chemicals arise and responds to certain situations. But the experience is subjective. So even when the cognitive science began, first you have neurobiology, okay? Then you have neuroscience. And neuroscience starts to take brain study quite seriously. Then within the neuroscience, the cognitive science emerges, which is more about understanding human cognition, intelligence, memory, and so on. And then finally, they evolve what is called the affective science. That's the emotion science. So Paul Ekman is one of the major founders in this field. So Paul was at that meeting, and what was memorable was that, because of that meeting, the Buddhist ideas, and particularly His Holiness's way of thinking, powerfully influenced Paul's work going forward. In fact, Paul Ekman and His Holiness jointly authored a book called Emotional Awareness. So this meeting was hugely influential and important. It's also because this was the meeting when explicit discussions took place on actually how can we then start studying these contemplative practices and sort of develop more secular adaptations of this. And this was also the meeting where His Holiness threw a challenge to the scientist, saying that, if you look at science, it's amazingly detailed on the pathologies of the human mind. So there's a whole Bible of the pathologies of the mind. But His Holiness said, but human mind is more than pathology. We also have positive qualities like compassion, empathy, kindness, and all of this. How come that science haven't studied them? So can't you use the same methodology of rigor, research, inquiry, experiments, and now look at positive, human qualities like compassion? So that was the challenge that His Holiness threw. And another challenge His Holiness threw to Mind and Life was, he said that, here we are all having this wonderful time, feeling deeply engaged and enriched, learning a lot and benefiting ourselves. But he said, out there is a world that is still suffering. Right. So many people could benefit from what we are learning and what we can share. What can we do so that more people can at least have an understanding of these possibilities? So hence, then the efforts were made to have a much more public Mind and Life. So in 2003 was when we had our first public Mind and Life. This was at MIT.
Yeah. So I understand it was, there were thousands of people in attendance and a very, very long wait list. What is it that you think drew so much interest in that event?
For a long time, there was a particular reading of human nature, a particular reading of Darwinian evolutionary theory has become the mainstream, that somehow our basic nature is aggressive, highly competitive, and pursuit of self-interest is the fundamental explanation for every human behavior. So there was very little room for compassion, altruism, even though Darwin himself did say this needs to be explained evolutionary, and the success or failure of evolutionary theory ultimately will depend on how well the theory can explain the presence of altruism in animals and human beings. So Darwin did not wish it away, but for some reason, the most influential version of Darwinian evolutionary theory that became so widespread was the kind of slightly darker side, So one of the things that His Holiness has really made an effort is to open up that discussion, our conception of human nature. And His Holiness has argued for long that yes, many of these drives, competitiveness, aggression, pursuit of self-interest, are important part of human behavior. They are evolutionary rooted and grounded. Equally are the more positive aspects. And his argument is that since we are social creatures, and since our initial survival depends so much on care, and among primates, we human beings are the ones that need longest period of gestation and infancy, during which if the parents abandon us, we're done. So he says that given that reality, nature must have equipped us with emotions and sentiments and qualities that allow us to connect and feel that bond. And in Buddhist language, that is empathy and compassion. But in scientific language, they will use something else, like attachment theory. So His Holiness's argument is that unless we are able to explain that presence of that emotion, and also which give rise to cooperation, because human beings are one creature that has amazing level capacity to cooperate. Like the cities are created by human beings. So unless you have a way to transcend narrow self-interest, we are not going to be able to explain this evolutionary kind of existence of this large-scale cooperation. His Holiness has made this philosophical argument fairly early on. Finally, science has changed. There were new kind of group of evolutionary scientists who began to take Darwin's challenge seriously, His Holiness's challenge seriously, and then they were rethinking of the whole evolutionary theory. And today, very few evolutionary scientists would question the reality of altruism. So I think the science itself was moving in a direction where they were a lot more receptive to the ideas that His Holiness is bringing. And furthermore, one key message that His Holiness is bringing is saying that in the end, to a large degree, resources for your own happiness lies within you. You can tap into your mind's own resources and learn some basic mental training, the ability to downregulate when you feel strong emotion, to take into account other people's perspective, to learn to transit your narrow self-centeredness, to feel bigger. All of these are ability that each one of us have, and the more we are able to utilize our own mind, the more we'll be able to promote our own well-being. And I think the culture and the scientific community was ready to listen to this because they are beginning to have new understanding of the potentials of the human mind, especially through the neuroimaging technologies, and so on. And then, of course, at the time, in the late 70s, John Kabat-Zinn's, mindfulness training, MBSR. MBSR was originally developed to help patients with chronic pain. There were studies being done, and so it all came together with mind and life dialogues, His Holiness's advocacy for greater role of mind, and all of this came together. So when the 2003 Mind and Life public event at MIT was announced, there was a huge interest, especially among the scientists.
Yeah, I think it's hard to imagine now that it was only 40 years ago. Mindfulness was barely known in the West. And now it's
all over the place.
Exactly, it's all over. And the other thing that really struck me about what you said, Jinpa, is not only His Holiness's focus, not only on depression, anxiety, and those difficult emotions, but also on flourishing and well-being and compassion.
Sure.
And that really playing a large role in shifting the scientific paradigm.
Sure.
I really appreciate that grounding.
I think this is important because one of the things that people will remember, anyone who has directly interacted with His Holiness, is even though he can be very serious in any of these discussions, he has this sharp razor-like kind of attention and intellect, but at the personal level, he is a joyful person. Happiness and joy is the primary, energy that you feel in his presence. So this is, I think, important to remind ourselves because sometimes, there's never going to be a life that is free of suffering. This is a central teaching from Buddhism. If you're looking for a life free of suffering, then you should not be a human being. It's just they don't go together. I mean, the challenges, adversities, and suffering are an important part of actually being a human. So I think this is a key message that His Holiness is bringing, is that where we do have a say is how we respond when we confront adversities, how we respond to the situations, tragedies, adversities in our life, suffering. And there, our mind can play a key role in whether we are able to maintain our composure or not. I think this is a simple idea, but a very powerful one. And also, His Holiness is reminding that as human beings, since we are a social creature, we are designed to be joyful. And most of us will seek that comfort and joy through social interaction with family members, seeking love, with friendship, and so on and so forth. And one of the key insights in Buddhism that His Holiness shares with Buddhist psychology, with the contemporary world, is that even though we can exercise will to get into something, to initiate something, to sustain our motivation, we need to find joy. Without joy, everything becomes a hard work. Yeah. But once joy kicks in, then it can become effortless. And joy is not in the sense of pleasurable sensation, but joy in the sense of satisfaction. And satisfaction, joy in the form of satisfaction, is tied to a sense of purpose. Yeah. If you have a purpose, and when you find yourself to be meaningful and serving some purpose, you have a sense of fulfillment. And this is a capacity every human being has. So I think, one thing that people should remember from His Holiness is really this quality of joy and the energy of joy. And, when you bring joy, you also have a lot more resilience. You're way more resilient and able to endure hardships, with a kind of a sense of irony, see the irony of life, and kind of humor. I had the privilege to be with His Holiness, assisting him as his interpreter for a 5-day dialogue with Archbishop Desmond Tutu, two of the most funny and joyful people. And the energy of the joy in the room during those 5 days was pretty amazing. And then both of these icons, now sadly Archbishop is gone, is that they were both deeply compassionate, serious world leaders, but they were also deeply joyful individuals. So I think reminding ourselves once in a while, bringing joy into our life, finding joy in what we do, is an important message. Because otherwise, human beings can become cynical. Because you read the news and everything is horrible, there are conflicts everywhere. So I think people start thinking we are such a horrible species, we're so cruel. Yes, we have capability. Human beings have, among all the species, human beings has the most cruel capability because of our ability, because of our big brain. So this is why human species are very complicated species. And, voices like His Holiness, every now and then reminding us to tap into our better self, that is the more compassionate, cooperative, kinder side, is important. Because there is this idea of self-fulfilling prophecy. So if we talk about doom and gloom all the time, and if we start believing that we humans are such horrible species, then we're going to fulfill that prophecy, because that's the story we tell ourselves. So I think, in philosophy and anthropology, they speak a lot about the importance of what they call metaphor and narratives, because human beings are ultimately storytelling creatures, and it is no coincidence that many of the great scriptures of world religions are full of stories, because stories are powerful vehicles that inspire people, through which important messages are conveyed. So the story we tell ourselves as a species needs to include the role of compassion, kindness, empathy, and cooperation. And this is, if there is one thing that His Holiness has made a significant contribution, it is there. The narrative, changing the narrative and forcing the scientific community, including evolutionary scientists, to recognize the role of compassion and empathy in defining who we are as a species.
Yeah. And even just knowing that these positive qualities are qualities that we can cultivate. I'm thinking about the great teacher Sharon Salzberg,
Yes.
and her particularly erudite focus on loving kindness, the metta meditation. And I think we do have a clip from early days, perhaps a
Yes.
very young Sharon Salzberg, with His
Sure,
Holiness.
sure.
When we teach mindfulness meditation, we make a distinction for people between attention and mindfulness, which has this quality of purity, of purifying the mind. And we also teach people to try to do this practice very continuously, as His Holiness mentioned yesterday, whether they are sitting or walking or drinking a cup of tea or doing some work in the world, whatever it is, so that we may focus on the breath to begin with, but really the practice becomes everything. Whatever activity is really meditation practice. And as people observe these sensations or these images or these feelings, and they come and go all of the time, they do begin to develop some insight, some understanding about the nature of things, particularly when there is strong continuity. When people can do this all of the time, then they do come to a place where they see a thought is just a thought, to have some even little bit of insight, not only of the body, but to see that the thoughts are also insubstantial, that they are empty in that way. Then they get, even with a little bit of understanding, they get a very great feeling of freedom.
Sharon Salzberg, many of the viewers will know, is one of the pioneers in bringing Buddhist-based meditation into the secular world, particularly a pioneer in bringing loving kindness and type practices. So Sharon has been an important kind of participant in the Mind and Life dialogue. So alongside John Kabat-Zinn is the mindfulness. Sharon is bringing loving kindness. So I think that is, you can see the pioneering nature of these conversations. Now, yes, on the science side, there has been quite a lot of benefit because, one of the things that His Holiness has hoped and which he had succeeded through Mind and Life is to keep pushing the boundaries of scientific inquiry, because science was very locked on to studying physics and matter. And now paying attention to emotion, attention, mindfulness, mental processes. Science was paying attention on the pathology side, in the medical side, clinical science, depression, anxiety, all of that. But now paying more attention to the faculties like attention, increasingly meta-awareness, compassion, empathy, the distinction between empathy and compassion. So all of these really offshoots coming out of this broader discussion that His Holiness is pushing, and always bringing compassion, the role of mind, mindfulness, awareness, study of emotion, human experience, the subjective experience into the discussion. But, whenever there is a deep dialogue, deep engagement, both sides come out changed. In any good dialogue, in any good interaction, if the change is only in one direction, that means the dialogue and the exchange hasn't been successful. So on the science side, we spoke a lot about what has happened, changing the conception of human nature, the whole emergence of science of emotion, science of compassion and empathy, increasing applications of mind-based approaches like mindfulness and compassion, and emotion regulation, and all of this. All of this is on the science side. But on the Buddhist side, there has been a huge influence as well, because His Holiness has been wanting to introduce formal education of science in the monasteries for a long, long time. But the monasteries are very conservative institutions, and that's their strength. Because if the institutions at the core, I personally believe, institutions for them to successfully survive, the core of the institution has to be conservative. Their primary concern is the continual protection and flourishing and the conservation of the classical education that has been there for centuries. They wouldn't want to be the abbot during which something went wrong.
Sure.
So, and innovation is always challenging. But the younger generation of the monastic members who grew up watching Mind and Life dialogues, by the time they became adults, the monastery was ready to change.
One of the most humbling and inspiring things that I've learned over the last year is the role that these dialogues play in the lives of Tibetan people. One monk said to me that other kids grow up watching the World Cup and Tibetan children grow up watching Mind and Life dialogues. So I understand that in 2013, a dialogue actually took place at a monastery in India. And what was the reason for that?
Yeah, this was the dialogue at Drepung Monastery. It's actually one of the largest, if not the largest, historically, monastery in Tibet. We say 7,500 monks, but Drepung before 1959 was over 10,000 monks. It's a massive monastic city, actually. So it's re-established in southern India. And His Holiness, expressed the wish that one of the Mind and Life dialogues, instead of happening in his residence in a very intimate setting, could take place in a major monastery so that all the monks, scholars can be witness to this actual live discussion. And it was fascinating because by that time, the monks have watched Mind and Life dialogues because every 2 years there is one in Dharamsala. They have watched this, so they are quite familiar. And also, there was a simultaneous translation into Tibetan for those who don't have the facility with English. And then, unlike other Mind and Life dialogues, in Drepung, because it was in a monastic setting, in the afternoon, late afternoon, with Diana Chapman Walsh, who was a board member at the time, and she was also one of the moderators at the conference. Diana and I facilitated a Q&A with the monastic scholars. So I interpreted, but also I kind of, helped them. And that was fascinating. We had an hour and a half every evening. And all of this really kind of made it possible for the senior members who still had some reservations about bringing science into monastic curriculum to really see how they can go well together. So I think for His Holiness, it was a hugely fulfilling moment for him to see this reality. And one of the things I hope you will show to the viewers, this amazing photograph of only a few of us presenting at Mind and Life, in the midst of thousands of monks on the footsteps in front of one of the halls. For us coming from the West, it was a truly memorable experience to be there in the midst of all of that. And then, because the monastic scholars are trained in the debating tradition, the evening engagement with the monastics was something that scientists and the scholars enjoyed it because it's so alive. So that was truly memorable. And His Holiness was very, very pleased. Yeah.
Education has been one of His Holiness's major themes, particularly education of the heart.
Yes.
And regulating one's emotions. And I think that's been a high priority.
Yes, yeah.
I think we have a short clip of neuroscientist Richie Davidson engaging with His Holiness on this topic.
We're going to be talking about some of the hard science about child development and how that provides a foundation for understanding social and emotional learning, and where the key opportunities may be in transforming the mind based upon what we know from modern science.
So these days, I really feel, in spite of any sort of material development, life become more easy, comfortable. But yes, it is suffering. But it's a lot of suffering because of emotion. We are facing some kind of crisis of emotion. So if you can remove this emotion through surgery, then I will relax. That's why we can relax.
Education has been an important area of interest and focus for His Holiness because His Holiness often says that the hope for future lies with the younger generation. And he says that sometimes the elder generation, we get so fixated and set in the ways in which we see the world and do our things that it's very hard to change. So if we want to truly transform society, then the work has to be done at the school level So, many of these ideas of the role of emotion, the ability to regulate your emotion, bringing awareness into your emotional experience, the social awareness, all of this is a fairly recent, kind of interest in education. Until recently, education was primarily development of the brain. A lot of it packing information, learning facts, and so on. And His Holiness has, for a long time, basically tried to remind the world that we're missing out on something. So he has advocated that now the time has come that the school itself, the education place itself, needs to look at both the development of the brain and the development of the heart. So on the education of the brain, modern system is fantastic. But education of the heart is one area where His Holiness's suggestion is to do it in a secular way, because in a multicultural, multi-religious context, it becomes an issue. Whereas furthermore, he argues that you don't even need religion to ground ethics. He's a big believer in naturalistic approach to ethics, because he says that if nobody wants to suffer, if everybody wishes for happiness, and everybody has the capacity to empathize and show kindness, those are the foundations that you have for universal ethics. And the human values emerge out of this. Human values are not taught by religion. He says, yes, they teach them, but human values are independent of religious belief. And in the education field, there has been a lot of, not so much on ethics per se, but on social, emotional development, there's been a lot of attention paid. Increasingly now, ethics is being brought in. So His Holiness's wish is half being realized, but the ethics side still needs to be brought in, because in the end, you want to create a new generation that cares for others, that cares for the planet that we share, that cares for concerns that are beyond themselves. So that comes from the quality of heart. In the old days, religion taught that, but if religion doesn't speak powerfully to individuals in society, then that has to be learned. And this is what His Holiness means by education of the heart. So there has been a lot of programs which are being done, and his constant call is to really pay attention in the school system.
What you've just mentioned kind of speaks to something you were raising earlier about his concern for the environment.
Yes.
And I understand that he had a conversation with Greta Thunberg back in 2021. Of course, she's a climate activist. I'm just wondering, what's that special place for young people that His Holiness holds in his heart, particularly those who are concerned about our planetary flourishing and planetary future?
Well, for a lot of people in the kind of environmental world, His Holiness is an icon. And in fact, not many people know, but among the Nobel Prize winners, Dalai Lama's Nobel Prize citation is the first one where environmental protection and awareness was mentioned.
I didn't know
So
that.
actually, so environmental advocacy of environmental consciousness has been an important part of his mission. As early as before I joined him, he was talking a lot about finding a way of life that is more in tune with the rhythms of natural environment. So he was advocating a kind of a wise way to differentiate between quality of life and standard of life. Standard of life is how much you earn, how much you own. Quality of life need not necessarily be the same as standard of life. So quality of life is a sense of satisfaction and joy, and where your basic needs are met and you have a rich life. So he started talking about that, and for his argument is that to have a good quality of life, you don't need to lead only a life of consumption. And then he was also pointing out that the natural resources are finite, they are not infinite. A time will come when the balance will shift in the wrong direction. So he used to say about how Mother Earth is very forgiving mother, but the time will come when the Mother Earth will say, I'm giving up. And that's exactly what's happening now with the climate crisis, and this is one of the reasons why His Holiness has such admiration for Greta Thunberg, because Greta, with her activism, with her ability to articulate, with the energy that she's bringing, she has managed to capture the imagination and the energy of the younger generation. So I think His Holiness was really happy when he had the opportunity to engage with her and be on the same panel. And at that meeting, His Holiness kind of said, our generation is the one that created the mess, but sadly, your generation will have to clean up. I mean, that's the reality. And his idea is that for every single action we do, there is always a global dimension. And as much as we can bring that awareness into our action, we will be more responsible and behave more responsibly. And he's right. I've seen him, whenever we move, get out of a room, he's going to be the one switching off the light. I mean, he's always in his own personal practice, and I've seen his own personal residence. His room is a kind of a corridor between two large rooms, his bedroom, with a single bed, cot, attached to the wall, with a simple kind of bedding, and with a small, carpet on the floor. And next to it, on the side, is a shower cubicle. And he lives a very simple life. And I think if people often forget that to lead a rich life, you don't need to lead a very consumption-oriented life.
We've spoken quite a bit about the dialogues. I'm just wondering, I'm thinking about all of the science that's come as a result of this. And I'm wondering if it was the dialogues only that were causing all of that, or if there were some other elements, because I'm aware too of this Summer Research Institute.
Yes.
I think it's been going on for 22 years or so. And I'm curious, what was the impetus or the inspiration around that week-long scientific exploration for emerging scholars?
I think there was a realization early on that if we are serious about this kind of science, because it's a different way of doing science, where we're bringing the role of mind, we're paying attention to our own experience, we are bringing contemplative practices as part of our everyday life. So if we're going to do this kind of science and we're going to promote this kind of science, there was a recognition that we actually need to cultivate the younger generation, the new researchers who will do this new way of doing science. So the Summer Research Institute idea came from there, to create a kind of a non-public platform where younger scientists and emerging scholars can engage with the senior scholars, including Buddhist teachers, to engage deeply together for a week, have 1 day of silent practice. So that was conceived as a way of creating a network and also collaboration across different multiple universities. So Summer Research Institute has been one of the great signature successes of Mind and Life. And after Summer Research Institute, then also came the idea of establishing a grant that would encourage pilot studies, because scientific studies are costly. But we can support pilot initiatives by junior scientists who may have innovative ideas. So we named the award after Varela, Francisco Varela. So it's called Varela Award. And sadly, Francisco Varela passed away untimely because of his health issues. But this has been hugely successful. The knock-on effects of the Varela grantees receiving further awards and research grants have been pretty impressive, especially from major institutions like the National Institute of Health, NIH, and so on. So Varela, those two programs targeting the younger generation, Summer Research Institute and Varela grants, have been tremendously successful, to complement the impact of dialogues.
Yeah, I think the statistic for those Varela grants are that over the course of the last 20 years, the return on investment from the Varela grant program has been over 4,000%.
Wow.
Which is remarkable by any, standard. And I think annualized, that's something just better than 22% annualized return on investment. Just because I think we choose well those who will receive these grants, and they're well supported because they have that Sangha. There's a community around them as well to help support them in their research.
And many of the very early Summer Research Institute and Varela grantees are now major professors in different universities.
It's sort of a who's who in meeting these people. Very humbling, honestly, to meet these people and to see what they've done with that small grant and what they've turned that into.
Yeah.
I really appreciate you taking time to share so much about not only the dialogues and the science, but also a view into His Holiness's private life and hopes.
Yes.
That's been particularly sweet for me. I have just one more clip to share with you. And this is from the 2019 dialogue when His Holiness engages with South African forgiveness researcher Pumla Gobodo Madikizela. She served on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission with Archbishop Desmond Tutu, also a great friend of His Holiness.
When we witness stories of others, the lives of others, there is always this possibility that we might be touched by them. And depending on how these stories connect with our own history, it may open up the emergence of the unexpected, which is a phrase I use in my work, the emergence of the unexpected, that it is in these moments of witnessing that draw us into the life of the other. It's almost as if you are reconstituting the self in relation to the other, reconstituting yourself by relating to what the story is and what it means for you, and how what rises out of that, what emerges, and the reciprocal, mutual witnessing of the other that creates this sense of community.
Now, time come, we must make effort to educate human beings the importance of warm-heartedness. This marvelous human brain must combine with warm-heartedness. Now, today's world, entire 7 billion human beings are one human community, live on one planet. We have to live side by side on this planet. So individual survival entirely depends on the community. So taking care about community is ultimately taking care of yourself.
This was a very memorable meeting where Pumla spoke about this African concept of Ubuntu, which has this very interesting idea of reconstitution of sense of self in the context of relationship with others. The famous phrase is, I am me because of you. So in the West, we tend to have this very discrete idea of individual selves as autonomous beings, in some ways independent of others. But the African concept of Ubuntu brings a very different flavor to the very idea of who we are as individuals, our sense of identity, whereas an emergent, interdependent, they don't use the language interdependent, but from the Buddhist point of view, it's the interdependent kind of dimension of our sense of self. And this is one area where Mind and Life dialogues have been very powerful in bringing diverse perspectives, because Mind and Life, a simple way of thinking about Mind and Life dialogue is like creating a container where people enter into conversations and think aloud together. That's one, sort of helpful way of thinking about this. And we don't go into a dialogue with a foregone conclusion and argue for our position, try to prove it. Mind and Life dialogue, this is one of the reasons why scientists and scholars presenting at Mind and Life dialogue, we always looked for people who are willing to learn, who see themselves also as an evergreen student. This is like His Holiness. His Holiness always says, I'm a student of the Buddha. So this perspective of you as evergreen learner is a hugely important part of a dialogue partner. Because otherwise, if you're there only to preach, then you are not open to listening to others. So, and Pumla's, that session was powerful. When His Holiness participates in these dialogues, sometimes we have a viewership that exceeds 1 million live viewers. That is massive for this kind of conversation. And that's, I believe, partly because Mind and Life dialogues have played a curating role in bringing key findings and ideas from science that people can actually use in their day-to-day life. Because it's one thing to have expert knowledge that stays in the shelf or in the computer and only someone with a white jacket can use it. But it is something else when every single person on earth who has a mind can use it. That becomes different. So that's one very important thing. The second thing is that because of the energy that His Holiness has brought to these dialogues, always reminding the humanity of who we are, constantly reminding us the big picture of why we are doing it. Even science has to serve humanity. The whole reason why there is science is for the flourishing and betterment of humanity and the world. And he's constantly reminding, let's not invert the purpose. You know, the science is there to serve humanity. So humanizing of science. So this constant reminder of compassion is an important role Mind and Life plays. And I hope, you know, His Holiness has expressed his aspiration and wish that Mind and Life mission outlives him, outlives me, and go beyond, you know, 21st century. And, you know, it's a small organization, but its imprint is quite large. And the questions that it's trying to address are perennial questions that concerns the well-being of the entire humanity and the world. So I hope His Holiness's wish that Mind and Life mission and the work will outlive him and go well beyond 21st century will be realized.
It's so hopeful, actually. It's so hopeful that whatever it is that ails us and that suffering, there are answers there that are qualities that we can cultivate.
I personally feel that it's very important for all of us, especially those who have children, to really not lose hope in humanity. And one way in which we can do that is to constantly remind ourselves there are great human beings on this planet that we can kind of, you know, look up to and which can continue to be a source of hope and inspiration.
Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Jinpa.